Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. I have someone back with me after a long time, Lieutenant General Syed Hasnain, who's going to probably clear up all the rumors and all the doubts in our heads about this whole Russia-Ukraine war and the so-called counteroffensive that has been taken up by the Ukrainians. How far are we reading into the narratives of the Ukrainians? What is the reality? It's going to be right here on Dev Talks. Thank you, sir, for joining me. And it's always a pleasure to have you back and to talk to you and to listen to your views.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back again after quite some time. I know I was a little off-road, but it's a great honor and a pleasure to rejoin you.
Thank you, sir. So let's just get into it. There's just so much of information, especially in the last 2 weeks, that has come out. I would say from the 1st of September, uh, people are touting victory, people are touting loss, people are touting defeats. Just as an opening comment, sir, are we reading too much into a battleground situation without really realizing the military aspect of it?
Adi, you hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. I think information warfare has got to us. Absolutely. It's become the need of the times, perhaps, and being overemphasized and over focused upon. So really, you cannot believe as to what is actually happening on the battlefield. But to just put common military knowledge to use here will be good enough. I do not want to complicate things here because I find that the Western media, including the Indian media to a very great extent, is actually overreading the situation and trying to delve too much into detail. This needs to be studied from a very simplistic angle because there isn't too much of exchange of territory as yet. What you're really seeing is the third phase really saying. The first was when the Russians came in, the initial forays that they made, the efforts they made to try and capture ground did not succeed. Subsequently, came down to only pulverization of corridors, logistics locations, towns and cities, etc. Did not make headway on ground in terms of capture of cities, except in the eastern part of Ukraine, as we are aware, the Donbass area. And this is the third coming, which is obvious after 8 months of being reinforced with a splurge of weapons, a tremendous amount of training that the Ukrainians have received, and a boost to their confidence. What they are attempting to do essentially is a series of riposts. And I'm surprised that people are not understanding the meaning of riposte. It is not counteroffensives which are going on. These are riposts which are going on essentially to hit the bases of the locations from where the offenses of the Russians have emanated into Ukraine. So this is also a temporary situation at the moment. There is no permanence of exchange of territories. And these are low-level maneuvers which have taken place across the fronts with not too much exchange of territories.
How do you look at the breakthroughs which has happened? And a lot of people are touting that as comparing it to the 91 Desert Storm. I mean, the tactics that the Ukrainians used on the ground were pretty much maneuver and high speed maneuver for that matter. So, militarily, how do you read this?
You see, 1990 was something very different. The Republican Guard at that time, the Iraqi Republican Guard, was strong, well trained, but wilted under pressure immediately because of the tremendous shock and awe which was used also. And those times, of course, it was used in 2003 also. But even in 1990, the ground maneuvers by armored forces, mechanized forces, was tremendous. Maneuver warfare of the typical kind was used. This is not something which has happened to a great extent here yet. The ground is such, yes, lots of built up areas, etc. It doesn't give you that kind of space for maneuver of the classic mechanized kind. Long drawn maneuvers going into deep forays, etc. That is not happening. And there's a tremendous amount of firepower which the Russians have used, and they continue to use it. But what is happening is that the Russians have seemed to be falling short of troops now. And it's quite evident from the fact that they've even pulled out troops from the Armenian-Azerbaijan front, where virtually they were keeping the peace there, and that's what has led to the breakdown on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Obviously, they are now foraging for troops from here and there. Possibly, you may even find troops coming out from Tajikistan, the very famous motorized division from there, coming into Ukraine to fight some battles here. But obviously, the Russians, good, effective use of artillery, missilery, rocketry, everything has been done. Tremendous amount of TNT has been delivered. But where the weakness lies is in their classic maneuver at the infantry, mechanized infantry level. That they have not been able to achieve. Getting into towns and cities has been a nightmare. Kiev, Kharkiv, and cities like that have held on completely and enabled logistics to be built up, logistics areas to come up, and allowed a degree of flexibility to the Ukrainian armed forces to retrain and re-equip themselves, which is why this opportunity has risen as the third phase, which the Ukrainians are utilizing very effectively.
So let's talk about two aspects of it. You hinted on this one little thing. Now, I'd like to actually take it a little forward. Have the Ukrainians been able to sacrifice? And they've had tremendous losses. If you believe that leaked report that came out was about 191,000 casualties, out of which I would say about 40,000-50,000 people have died. That's a huge number. How do you see the Ukrainians actually keeping the battle up? Were they sacrificing this manpower to buy time for their forces to get trained back in NATO bases and stuff like that? And when you look at it from the Russian aspect, how serious is this military setback for them?
Two good questions. First of all, statistics and figures in this war are something which are not always very credible.
Yeah.
Most of it is emanating from Western sources, obviously to create a picture of despair also to some extent, and to show that the Russians have been very unfair. They have shown very high-level casualties of Ukrainians, which may not entirely be true. Of course, lots of towns and villages, etc., have got wasted. Lots and lots of people have got displaced into other European countries. No doubt the situation is bad. But I still do think that it's not that bad. Logistically, the whole western front of Ukraine is open. Everything is coming in from there. So from a maintenance, humanitarian, logistics angle, it isn't as bad as it is perhaps being made out to be. Yes, cities have got wasted. There are lots and lots of casualties. Typical human rights kind of situations where you find shelters coming down and things like that. These create pathetic kind of images on international media. There's no doubt about it. The Russian information warfare has been very, very poor. First of all, of course, the language part of it. They've taken casualties. They've taken a fair amount of casualties. But again, it's not as exaggerated as what is being made out by the Western media, right? So from the overall humanitarian angle, yes, this is an unfortunate situation which has been created, but it isn't as bad as it has been made out to be. I know it's been a little unfair sitting away from the battlefield and speaking like this, but then this is something that you have to comment upon. As far as the Russians are concerned, their overall capability has been affected. There's no doubt about it. That's why, as I said, they are now trying to pick resources from all over to fight. Russia is a huge country. 140 million population distributed over a country as large as that doesn't create that kind of sentiment, perhaps, and it's not an interconnected country to such a great extent. So there are pockets all over. There are sentiments which are being expressed in different places, but by and large, the government is pulling through with this. Despite the body bag culture going home and things like that, the government is still pulling through, and Putin seems to be still reasonably popular. It's not as if he's taken a huge dent. Let me just delve into this. The recent summit at Samarkand did show a slightly different picture of President Putin. It showed him losing confidence. It appears to be losing confidence. And the manner in which China and India both spoke out on this, of course, they didn't speak out so openly, but hinted adequately to say that the Russians now need to pipe down. They need to now see that this war may not be winnable. and that at the end of it, at conflict termination stage, it shouldn't be that they are the complete losers. This is the time when the international community at large is looking at a situation where you need to look at economics, you need to look at international economics, you need to look at energy security. These are the kind of issues instead of looking at war. We are just coming out of a pandemic, an international pandemic, the COVID. We are in the middle of an energy crisis in Europe at the moment. And therefore, the world needs to do much more to manage the economy of the world rather than just fighting an unnecessary war. So, to that extent, I think Russia is under pressure. Not so much from the battlefield as the international imagery kind of, the imaging kind of thing. That is what
Optics.
is really putting the pressure on President Putin at the moment.
True, sir. Optics actually play a big game, and as a matter of fact, I think the SEO summit, as you mentioned, seems like a whole optic game that was played across to fare up a certain, opposition, if I may. I'd like to keep the energy security for a question later, but actually dwell into intelligence, sir. There was a report that came out or an article that was written in New York Times, and I personally don't put a lot of heat into the reporting of New York Times, but when they talk about Western and NATO intelligence actually helping uh, Ukraine conducting or planning, as a matter of fact, that's the word they use, planning this so-called offensive or a repost, as you say. Um, how do you see the Russians looking at a situation where NATO is now actually on the battlefield taking decisions, although that might be happening before? But the Russians have also said that do not cross the red line. So, how do you see this situation going forward, sir?
NATO has been involved in this from day one, right? Without NATO's confidence and backing given to Ukraine, this war would perhaps never have taken place. But in the last 7 months, um, I think things have moved on. Technologies have come into effect, and obviously, NATO technology, Western technology, now surpasses the Russians far beyond. Uh, the Chinese have been in assistance of the Russians, but it's quite evident that militarily they are not with them in that manner in which NATO is with Ukraine. Obviously, uh, the maturing of intelligence takes time, and 7 months is a fairly long period in which I think intelligence has really matured, and therefore this is one credit line which they are claiming, which is, I think, genuine, which without NATO's absolute battlefield transparency, which they've achieved on this entire front, I don't think the Ukrainians could have had the courage to be able to now carry out these reports with a degree of confidence, right? They've been supported with equipment, they've been supported with training. A lot of training is taken place outside the shores of Ukraine, away from the borders of Ukraine. Um, and it is effective. It's proving to be quite effective. The one place where they were weak was in artillery and in missilery. That seems to have been made up to a great extent. Drones have come in a big way. That has come in very effectively. And the Ukrainians are making very effective use of their armor. It seems at one time everyone was writing off the tank, but it seems that recent imaging shows uh, tanks being used in a reasonably more offensive manner, and I think that's making a lot of difference. The command and control elements of the Russian armed forces are obviously being affected very deeply by the kind of intelligence capability which the NATO has developed. So this we saw shades of it right in the beginning. If you remember, when 12 or 14 Russian generals were killed in the first 1 month of the war, if you remember, because of the targeting that they had achieved of the headquarters, the kind of intelligence that they had picked up of all the different Russian headquarters in the battlefield. Now, that capability obviously has doubled, probably tripled. And,
Triple.
and that is really coming to the fore and is helping out in these so called riposts or counteroffensives, as they prefer to call it.
Sir, uh, let's talk about energies. A lot of people actually have come to the belief now that the Russians can actually move forward and actually finish this operation pretty fast, but they're kind of waiting because they know that winter will change the dynamics globally. The growing crisis within Europe, and we see Italy sidelining, we see Hungary sidelining, we see Serbia going off. There are, rumors of Austria being disillusioned. Some politicians in Finland are starting to speak. Germany is in big trouble. Uh, how do you see this sort of a situation where the battlefield is now not on the battlefield, but a larger strategic, I would say, conflict within Europe?
Yes, this is the million-dollar question at the moment. That people expected that this war will last a month, 2 months, 3 months, perhaps, but it's gone on beyond and is going into the winter now. And obviously, well before winter, there are a degree of worries which are going on because the Russians have cut back on supplies and without any alternatives easily available to Europe. So obviously, there are a lot of attempts at management going on at the moment, and there are divisions taking place within NATO, within Europe, uh, which are bound to take place as we go along further towards winter. Depends on the capability and winter management of a particular country, how much reserves it's got, how much energy capability it has got, what it has been able to negotiate, how strong is its currency. There's so many factors which come into the whole aspect of energy management. But as a starter, I think the information warfare focus of the West seems to have been uh, addressed to the Russians to say, as if this war is not going anywhere, the Russians are not going to win. It's best to sue for peace at this time. It's good to come back to the table so that well before winter, the arrangements for Europe's winter can be set into place and the economies can start recovery. How much will this play up into Putin's mind? How much will this play up depends on what the ground situation is. As I said, the ground situation isn't too bad still. But if it becomes obvious that the Russians cannot hold on and a victory of sorts, a military victory of sorts, is on the cards, the Putin may just sue for peace. But before that, the dangerous part of it is the kind of threats which are emerging in terms of nuclear. The nuclear dimension is something which anyone and any time when you have a existential threat, you start threatening with a small nuke here, a small nuke there. A demonstration against a nuclear power plant, which is what is happening very often there. These are the kind of things which are pinpricks. And therefore, we are now into the end of September, almost nearing end of September. November, December is the time when Europe really starts wilting under the pressure of winter. So you really effectively have 2.5 months actually available with you. These 2.5 months are very crucial. I hope there will be some initiatives from somewhere. It doesn't seem, at the moment, there seems to be no power under the sun who can take initiatives and bring both sides to the table. The Ukrainian president is hell-bent on continuing. Putin is under pressure at the moment. So it's a very awkward kind of situation in which a small decision could make a difference. And perhaps that kind of leadership is expected from the United States, I would say. It should come from the United States because the larger picture is in their hands. They have to decide. After all, it's not America which is going to suffer the winter. It is going to be Europe which is going to suffer the winter. And therefore, they need to take the Europeans on board and need to speak out on this a little more and hopefully bring the Russians to the negotiating table. But if you continue to act and put them under pressure, I'm afraid this is not going to lead us anywhere. The one last thing on this aspect which I would like to comment upon is no one seems to be speaking about the Black Sea. Right? Remember, everything seems to be land-based. Everything seems to be focused on Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Donbass. Not realizing that the entire southern segment is still with the Russians. The Russians have wanted Crimea. They've got Crimea. They have wanted access to the Sea of Azov, to Odessa, etc. They've got all that intact with them. This is an area which I think NATO has to virtually surrender and say, okay, let's leave the maritime part of it out. Black Sea at the moment is with the Russians. Let's look purely at the land borders. Let's look at purely at the land areas to see, can we sue for peace here?
Somewhere down the line, you can probably see the focus towards the lands. But I want to ask you an additional question on this particular aspect. So we are also getting reports of lack of weapons. Ukrainian units are now actually, after the offensive and the whole aura of it died down, there are reports coming out, and I follow a lot of these Ukrainian channels, and when they talk about lack of weapons, you know there's something wrong. Uh, Germany said we don't have weapons anymore. Canada is saying we can't do it anymore. England, well, they're going to last out till the time the Boris Johnson effects, kind of stays on. I don't know how Liz Truss is going to take forward. Nothing has happened because of the Queen's passing. But we don't see NATO being able to supply the kind of weapons that Ukraine is asking for. HIMARS is in a big shortage, as a matter of fact. That's something that we know. Even Zelensky has mentioned this in an interview recently. How do you see this part? Because when you look at the other side, the expenditure of weapons and ammunition is humongous. It's almost 10 to 12 to 15 times of what is being done here.
I think NATO is being slightly careful about this, if you ask me. If you open up the coffers, all these countries have got their reserves. After all, NATO is catering for wars for a long time. They have all the reserves. They have supplied the Ukrainians a fair amount. It's a question of how much can you absorb. The Ukrainians have absorbed a lot. There is no doubt about it. They've lost a lot. They've absorbed a lot. But to keep this open-ended is something which is, to my mind, a very difficult proposition. I think they've got enough at the moment to be able to cater for the kind of offenses that they are putting in.
Okay.
To splurge them with this will unnecessarily increase the chances of extension of it. Then you're going to get very, very, offensive towards the Russians. You may start looking at gaining greater territories. Donbass itself, well, they are hitting back, but I don't think they're making that kind of difference, which will mean that the whole of Donbass is going to fall back to the Ukrainians. No, it's not going to happen. Remember, that area is ethnically still Russian, and therefore to fight a war there effectively, you can't without. I mean, the Russians have got a major advantage there. There's no doubt about it. So I don't see this war ending in a major victory for anyone at all. I think that is one of the reasons why NATO is calibrating. And that's a sensible decision to my mind. This calibration is right, because otherwise, the Ukrainian leadership can go berserk on this completely, and the entire thing can go topsy-turvy.
Thank you for mentioning that, because that's something that I've been wondering about. So let's talk about the disinformation. Recently there's been a report, and I believe the US government has wrapped a lot of people within the country with regards to disinformation. There were people put on kill lists or hit lists or blacklists within the Ukrainian setup, and we also had a sort of an assassination, actually an actual assassination within Russia as well, of a person who was there in that blacklist. Now, there's a lot of disinformation happening here. US has actually tried to put a stop to it by a certain thing. My question is, will the quality of reporting of the war in Ukraine improve?
Interesting. But remember one thing, we are seeing the beginning of what the US administration, and this initiative seems to have come from the White House itself. We are just seeing the beginning of this, the return of ethics to reporting, the return of ethics to, information management. The world of technology, social media, etc., has given the opportunity to such an extent that there is no end to the kind of exploitation which can be done, and ethics be damned completely. This is what has been the rule in the last couple of years. This seems to be getting arrested to an extent, because the directions which have come from the White House appear to have gone even to the US Central Command in Qatar. It's not just that they're looking at the European theater, they're looking at actually the whole of Central Command. So we may see some changes taking place in the near future, but not immediately. I don't think this is going to happen immediately. This will be examined. It will take its time. By the time doctrines are reset, etc., it takes a little time to do all this. Till then, I don't see any major change taking place, because the tempo is going at the moment in Ukraine, in Europe. The tempo has been built up, and they are aware that information warfare is making a difference. It is hitting the Russians hard. The Russians are not being able to break through the web of all this because of language issues, etc. And therefore, they are sensing advantage. So I don't think that we are going to see major changes in this policy in the near future anytime, because advantage still seems to be with NATO through this information warfare route.
True, sir. Uh, just two more questions, and the first one I'd like to talk to you about Donbass. You mentioned this, and a lot of the watchers and keen watchers of the war, I'd like to say I follow the keen watchers. I'm not a really keen watcher, but I'd like to follow and learn. They talk about the fact that the actual battle of this war happens in Donbass. The actual fighting is happening in Donbass. The Russians have been a bit restrictive in terms of their special military operation rules, and there is condemnation within Russia today of Putin. There's actually mass condemnation. People are unhappy of the fact that Putin is not putting the force which is required to this thing. So there's popular support for this, and the battle is happening in Donbass. Uh, are we ignoring that particular battle, which is the key and which has been mentioned by Putin as one of the objectives? And what about the rest of the two objectives of demilitarization and denazification? Because demilitarization with NATO coming in doesn't seem like happening, and I really don't want to talk about the rest of it because there's a lot of clutter within that.
You see, this whole concept of demilitarization, denazification, etc., would have come into effect if there had been deep penetration, if major cities like Kharkiv and Kiev had been captured, if the Western Front had been denied to the Ukrainians, access to the European countries had been denied to the Ukrainians. All that didn't happen. So, really saying that doctrine remained on paper and has really not succeeded as such. Whatever is happening in these terms is happening in the Donbass. All efforts have been going on in Donbass. The idea was to rest the front perhaps on the Dnieper River and emphasize focus on the ethnic demographic advantage that they have in Donbass. But the Ukrainians have fought back hard there too. They've lost cities, but there has been a ding-dong battle going on here and there. The Russians haven't really proved their worth in terms of infantry and armor battles, as we have said. And today they are suspect even today. So I think overall on the war front, if you really see it, special operations, denazification, demobilization, all the doctrines seem to have gone all right, absolutely at the moment. And probably there'll have to be if the Russians want to continue this fight, if Putin wants to continue this war, there will have to be a recalibration and a fresh doctrines perhaps will have to be created to see how they can take this forward. And I see this now stretching into the strategic arena, more into the energy domain and things like that, diplomatic energy domain and things like that.
That's a very wise analysis. Which brings me to my last question. The sustenance of a battle is also to do with your industrial capacity to supply that battle. Of course, the West has its huge this thing, but with the Americans trying to also open up another front on with China, as a matter of fact, recent comments by Joe Biden have not helped the whole situation, where he said that we will get in soldiers to kind of help Taiwan. So there's going to be probably preparations happening both ends. So how do you see the Russian industrial warfare playing a game in this? Because they've been able to keep it up till now, and reports are they've got enough to kind of move forward. Their international supplies are also on time as of now. Minor delays here and there. And secondly, sir, militarily, what do you see happening forward in the southeast of Ukraine? Because that's where the effort seems to be now.
Industrially, economically, it was a surprise that the Russians could sustain. I think the Americans would be perhaps the people most surprised by this. The fact that the Russians could draw international support. Well, India, for example, purchasing oil from them. China, two of the biggest buyers are there supporting this whole thing. The world is learning to be more independent. The world is learning to be more multilateral. India is one of those countries which has become much more confident with this. And because of these efforts, Russia has been able to sustain. And it seems that it will continue to sustain itself. It's not that it's just collapsed. Of course, NATO and Europe is trying to put together lots and lots of ways by which it can sort of paralyze the Russian economy. For example, insurance. the movement of energy resources. They're trying to prevent anyone carrying Russian energy, ensuring Russian energy, transporting it, and things like that. They're trying all these kind of efforts by right and left maneuver, but it doesn't seem to be working out to that extent, because the world has learned to be a little more independent. Networks, supply chains have all sort of, separated and become less interdependent on each other completely. So, to that extent, I think the Russian industrial capability is still very much there. But the statements emanating from China, see, Chinese interests are linked with the United States, economic interests are linked with the United States, linked with the European Union to such a great extent. Uh, the Chinese are not in a bubble. They don't live in an economic bubble. They have to continue with these networks. And whatever you're hearing from Xi Jinping obviously is a part of this overall strategy. They can't go 100% in support of Russia, fighting in Ukraine, fighting the European Union, creating this kind of a situation which has been created. Right? I foresee, and this is something we have not discussed fully, we will leave it for some other time. I foresee a greater Chinese effort to try and bring SCO, make SCO into a greater Eurasian kind of an entity, spreading from Turkey into Central Asia. Already there are countries lined up to join. India is the chairperson for the chair nation for the next year. As such, Turkey is looking for becoming a permanent member. Iran has become a permanent member. So this area is emerging as a very, very important area. And this is what the Russians are depending on. The Russians are not going to depend on Europe for their economic sustenance in the future. This is the kind of area. 72 million people occupy Central Asia. Remember, and then there are parts of Eastern Europe like Turkey which want to join into it. Then there's the Middle East, the UAE, there is Saudi Arabia, the other countries. Of course, Saudis are part of the American camp, of course, but then there are important countries here in the Middle East also, which are part of this overall chain. So I do see a fairly substantive shift in geopolitics taking place. You see, earlier we were finding only the Indo-Pacific emerging, and you were finding this theater of Europe emerging. And in the middle, you had these wars going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, etc. Now it seems that over. This is the area of Eurasia, which the world's which these countries seem to be looking at. It's going to be in India's interest also to a great extent to see how it manages its relationships with this particular area. I think we made a very good beginning with SCO this time, with Iran in particular, Chabahar project opening up all over again, the North-South corridor also probably being looked at very positively with the Russians. I think things are working out for India to a great extent also.
So I must say, I've been, following geopolitics for about 2 years now, and this war, as long since the first gunshot was fired, but this is one of the most level-headed analysis I've seen, and I'd like to commend you on that because it sans the rhetoric, uh, which we see so much today, and especially when you look at the Russian side, there's so much rhetoric. You look at the American side, there's so much rhetoric, and there are hints of sanity in the middle. I think you've collected all that sanity and put this into a talk. I'd like to commend you on this. So thank you so much for taking the time out to study, and of course, elaborate the whole situation in under half an hour. It's takes some talent to do that. I'd like to catch up with you for another one. So as a matter of fact, you've given us a hint, and I'd like to leave this to the audience that I'm going to get General Hasnain to talk about this emerging global order where we see India playing a little more of a, I would say a stronger role to command a certain aspect of the global order today, because we see that happening in front of us. Putin Saab had to listen to Modi Saab when he said this is not the era of war, and it's not happened before. So there's a lot which we're
And the
gonna do.
presence of Mr. Jaishankar at New York at this time, meeting any number of representatives, I think this is an indicator how confident we are. We don't have our prime minister there this time. Our foreign minister is representing us at the UN summit this time.
So there's just a lot, and I'm gonna coax General Hasnain to come back and talk about this particular thing. But sir, till then, thank you so much once again. It's always a pleasure talking to you, learning. Till next time, sir. Jai Hind.
Thank you. Jai Hind.